On Friday, January 27th, Christine and Jenna fought back against their killers. They fought so hard that their killer's DNA got embedded under their fingernails. That killer's DNA was not Tim's. DNA testing definitively excluded him. In the struggle, Christine broke her ring finger and the ring she was wearing. The killer's DNA was on that ring. Again, DNA evidence excluded Tim. Christine fought back so hard that she injured her killer, sending his blood onto the ceiling. Again, that DNA was not Tim's. Tim did not kill Christine and Jenna. Tim was not told to kill Christine or Jenna. And Tim did not have any motive, any incentive, or any reason to kill Christine or Jenna. Despite evidence that points away from Tim, despite the lack of physical evidence and the absence of any motive, the state will ask you to convict a man for murders he did not commit. Tim is not guilty. This will be a long case, and at the end, you're going to have a lot of questions. Questions that aren't trivial. Questions that are serious and fundamental, that any person would want answered, especially in a case of this magnitude. Questions about the quality of the evidence. These questions are what reasonable doubt is. And the state won't have the answers to these questions. Among others, they won't and can't answer when were the women killed, how were they killed, how many people were involved, and crucially, why were they killed? Who had the motive to kill them? The state may say at the end that they don't have to answer these questions. But don't let the state dismiss questions that they can't answer as questions that don't matter. The state must answer every question that gives you reasonable doubt. And when they don't, you must acquit Tim. The state's inability to answer these questions starts with the investigation. The police carried out a distracted and incomplete investigation. Their errors were so egregious that we had to stop the first trial more than 2 weeks into evidence. The state may tell you that that's all in the past. And in one important respect, that's true. What's done is done. There's no going back in time to conduct a thorough and focused and proper investigation. There's no transforming an unreliable investigation into a reliable investigation. Now, we're not saying that this was a dishonest investigation, but rather that it was fatally flawed. And it was flawed in a variety of ways. Throughout this case and throughout the evidence, you'll see patterns. The state didn't collect evidence that they should have. The state didn't test scientific evidence they should have. The state ignored leads they shouldn't have. The state trusted self-interested people and dubious sources that they shouldn't have. And based on that, they made choices and decisions about this case that they shouldn't have. The damage of those decisions resonates to this moment. The foundation of the state's case is weak, and most importantly, its orientation toward Tim is misplaced and wrong. It will not withstand your scrutiny. So, what's the broader framework of this case? Well, it starts with drugs. The state told you, each of you last week, that this case involves drug users and drug sellers. In fact, this case sits within a dynamic universe of people buying drugs to use them, people buying drugs to sell them, people selling drugs to buy more drugs, and most importantly, people striving to grow their drug-selling enterprise. Now, Tim himself had bought drugs, he used drugs, and he sold drugs for Dean. But he had no desire for bigger and better things in the drug world. In fact, one source of tension between Tim and other players in this case was his growing detachment from this world. He was seen as lazy and becoming unreliable. And that was a problem for the committed guys. Buyers were getting angry. Revenue streams were becoming threatened. And word about this was getting back to Dean, the boss, who texted Josh, the guy Dean saw as Tim's replacement, that Tim was, quote, being stupid, and that Dean wouldn't let it slide. So how did things get to that point? Well, it starts with Dean and Christine. They'd met a few years back in Florida, and Christine came to New Hampshire to help Dean with his drug operations here. In 2017, Dean also had a home in Cape Coral, Florida, where he spent most of his time running another corner of his drug business. Meanwhile, Christine was up here running the drug business in New Hampshire. She also had a legitimate side business of her own, selling secondhand items she refurbished. Tim had become friends with Dean and Christine, meeting Dean through going to music festivals. Tim would end up selling drugs for them to local people in the area. He would also look after the house when both of them were gone, and he often did errands or chores for Christine. At the time of the murders, he lived in Dover with his girlfriend, and his parents and brother lived nearby. Now, Dean and Christine were romantic partners as much as they were business partners. But by 2016 and 2017, both of those relationships completely deteriorated. Dean saw Christine as a disloyal, lying bitch. His words. Christine was getting in the way and jeopardizing Dean's drug enterprise. He couldn't wait until she was out of the picture, one way or another. 2016 is also the time that Josh Caldwell enters the picture. Now, Tim and Josh were from the same area and knew each other in the early 2000s through a mutual friend. They fell out of touch but reconnected in 2016. And at that time, people owed Dean drug money. People were in debt to him. And Dean wanted his money. He needed somebody to collect his debt for him. And that was a job that everyone knew that Tim did not, could not, and would not do. You'll hear that Tim is gentle and deferential, is not an aggressive guy. Tim introduced Dean and Josh in the fall of 2016. Josh seemed to fit the profile of what Dean was looking for, a go-getter. Now, you're going to hear from Josh. He's going to present to you today as a reformed man. But back in 2017, he was a leader of a motorcycle gang. Josh used drugs, he sold drugs, and people in that circle did the same. Josh didn't have a legitimate job. Not only was he in a motorcycle gang, but he was a high-ranking member. They were called the Mountain Men, and they're well known to law enforcement. Josh was the sergeant of arms for the club. He was responsible for keeping members in line, both inside and outside the clubhouse. Josh had power over who could be initiated into the group and who should be expelled. He was also a liaison to similar crews across state lines. He took his powerful role seriously. And there were strict rules amongst these brothers. That's how they called each other, including oaths to not speak to the police and codes of silence. Mutual fear amongst these brothers kept members in line. This was not Bible study. Ultimately, you'll see how quickly Josh abandoned this code to deflect suspicion and misdirect police in this case. But with the Mountain Men, he was deeply invested in making a career, his words, with them. On the other hand, Tim had no involvement with a gang or a club. He was not a member of the Mountain Men. He didn't even own a motorcycle. Tim is an artist. He liked to drink beer and liquor and play video games and listen to music. He was kind of a loafer, kind of unambitious. And like I said earlier, that's how Josh came into the picture. Josh will admit to you that Dean originally hired him to be his muscle, to collect Dean's drug debt. But their relationship quickly evolved. Josh will say he never actually collected drug debt for Dean. We may never know if that's a truth or a lie. But we do know, and what the evidence will show, is that Dean and Josh quickly saw opportunities in each other. Josh will lie about the premise of his arrangement with Dean. He'll say it had nothing to do with the Mountain Men. But you'll see evidence for why that's not believable. In November of 2016, shortly after Josh had met Dean, Dean brought Josh down to Florida so Josh could help Dean collect debt. The next month, Dean invited Josh down to Florida again, but this time for a vacation. And Josh's girlfriend, Cassie, was invited too. Josh was moving up. To Dean, Josh represented untapped streams of drug revenue. Josh's connections both inside and outside of the club meant more numbers. More people to work for Dean, more people to buy drugs from Dean, more people to collect his debt. And as an added benefit, those men came with a code of silence. Now, fast forward to the week of the murders, and Josh was devising a whole system to track this budding enterprise with Dean. To cover their digital tracks, Josh named their business the Hill Ranch Installations. This is not dissimilar to one of his other drug dealing enterprises, in which drug deals were referred to as snowplow contracts. You'll hear about that also. On January 25th, 2 days before the murders, Dean and Josh exchanged giddy texts about their dreams. Dean says, I'm committing each and every resource to this, and it's going to be one hell of a trick, brother. Josh responds, it's going to be a hell of a year, bro. These two cannot wait to get their new and exciting partnership started and be done with their old ties for good. Now, what made Dean and Josh so enthusiastic that week about becoming partners? Well, the previous weekend, the weekend before the murders, Josh invited Dean to come to a party thrown by the Mountain Men at the Mountain Men's Clubhouse. He introduces Dean to his crew, to his brothers. This meant a lot to Josh. He was proving himself to Dean and to his crew. After Dean left the party, Josh texted Dean thanking him for coming and for hanging out with me and my brothers. Josh texted Dean that it meant a lot to him that he came down despite Dean's busy schedule. Dean tells Josh, I was glad to be there, bro. He praises the Mountain Men as quite the clan of good dudes. Josh tells Dean that he truly considers him a brother, and he's proud to call him that. Soon, Josh is signing off his texts with Dean with love and respect, the same tagline he used with his brothers in the Mountain Men. So a few days later, when Dean texts Josh that he's committed every and each resource to this, and that it's going to be a hell of a year, it's because that day Josh told him 20 minutes prior that people are, quote, chomping at the bit to buy his drugs. This is good news for Dean. He asks Josh, I take it there was a very good impression made. Josh responds, very, my brother, very. Remember, this is just days after Josh introduced Dean to the Mountain Men. The same week, the week before the murders, Dean and Josh would discuss the Tim problem. Tim was distancing himself, becoming hard to reach. He was missing delivery appointments. You'll hear from others how Tim was getting sick of this world, but leaving it isn't easy. Instead of saying he wanted out, he would tell them that he just wasn't feeling well or was confused, or that he wasn't feeling like himself. Now, Josh knew that Tim was slacking, and Josh knew that Dean was getting fed up with it. Oh, and Josh knew that Dean hated Christine. Dean would tell things to Josh like, I'm so fucking sick of that bitch. I have to get her out of my life as soon as possible. Josh was ready to seize the opportunity in front of him, and Dean welcomed it. Tim was becoming disposable. On January 25th, 2 days before the murders, Dean was about to head to Florida. But not before Dean and Josh texted each other about the importance of seeing each other. 3 a.m, Josh went to Peterborough, Dean's house. You'll see video from the home surveillance system showing Josh and Dean at that time. You'll see Dean showing Josh and pointing out the surveillance system. Before that, Josh had no need to know about the surveillance system. But for some reason, that early morning, Dean wanted to make sure Josh knew how it operated. Then they walked out of the house, Josh went home, and Christine drove Dean to the airport. When Dean flew back 5 days later, Christine was dead, and Josh picked him up at the airport. You may be tempted to fixate on those 2 or 3 days, but doing so would be at the expense of critical context and essential information. That could help explain what happened. Another reason that you must consider the context is because what we know about that weekend is limited by the incomplete investigation that followed. An investigation that was sloppy, distracted, and mismanaged. A pattern you'll see throughout the evidence is that the police listened to the wrong people, they looked in the wrong directions, and they missed leads that could never be recovered. Now, when it comes to the investigation, it's important to know that federal agents were investigating Dean's multi-state drug operation prior to the murders. And within days of the murders, before the crime scene was even cleared, the New Hampshire police learned about that investigation. Within a few weeks, a decision was made to leave to the feds the drug investigation and New Hampshire to be in charge of the murder investigation. However, the federal agency would still use state manpower to pursue their own drug investigation, even though those officers remained assigned to the murder investigation. These investigators continued pursuing the drug investigation both here in New Hampshire and throughout the country. They went to Florida and California with the DEA. They repeatedly interviewed individuals in New Hampshire about the drug operation. They wiretapped witnesses to record conversations. And they dug up Dean's backyard with a backhoe 6 months after the murders. Remember, when it comes to the murders, you'll see they zeroed in on Tim almost immediately, and they got tunnel vision. They treated incomplete evidence as complete. And again, you'll recognize a pattern that they were steered toward Tim by individuals who had every incentive to lie, every incentive to divert attention away from them, and every incentive to get in good with the police. Over time, you'll see that leads were missed, suspects were ignored, and physical evidence was ignored. Ultimately, the disjointed investigation caused a mistrial in 2019. That's because the state's lead investigator failed to turn over a significant amount of evidence until the middle of trial. Mistrial means that there was so much non-disclosed evidence that the trial literally had to end so it could be sorted through. The bottom line is that a lack of professionalism raises a lack of confidence in the decisions and results of this investigation. Now, we're not saying that the police or the state were intentionally hiding anything. But if the investigation had been done properly, they'd be telling a different story. Now, you'll hear the state talk with confidence about their case. And we know their case didn't materialize out of thin air. But you need to think critically about what you see and what you don't see. You already saw a video of Tim obscuring a camera, but he wasn't the only person to do that. Why would people using drugs want to obscure a camera? You'll hear scientific evidence, like DNA and fingerprint evidence. You'll hear how Tim's fingerprints were found on a few items at the house that were associated with the murders. We won't dispute that those fingerprints are his, but no one can say how, or more importantly, when Tim handled those items. In fact, you'll see evidence that indicates that he touched those items and used those bags long before the murders. You'll hear that his fingerprints weren't pressed in blood. Don't take what the state says at face value. Think critically and hold them to their burden. You'll also hear about the many items associated with the murder that either didn't have Tim's fingerprints, had other people's fingerprints, were never collected by investigators in the first place, or had prints on them that could have been compared to other suspects, but weren't. And what about DNA evidence? You heard about a sweat-stained hat associated with Tim that tested positive for his DNA. But you'll hear that Tim, and see that Tim had a lot of these identical hats. So its presence at the house isn't all that insightful. More importantly, you'll hear about the other male DNA evidence tied much more closely to the murders. I mentioned earlier male blood on the ceiling. That was found in the kitchen, directly above where Christine's blood was found, directly above where she fought back against the man who murdered her. That blood is not Tim's. And the state never bothered to test it against any of the other male DNA they collected in this investigation, or that they could have. Same with the male DNA found under both Jenna and Christine's fingernails, and the DNA found on Christine's ring. Not Tim's and not tested against others. That's an example of what I say, that leads weren't followed or scientific evidence wasn't examined. You also heard about cell phone towers. That cell phone towers can indicate a person's location. You'll hear that these records indicate that Tim was in or around Farmington on Friday. But you'll also hear that this type of data is approximate and imprecise. It wasn't created by phone companies to track locations. It just reflects which tower provided the strongest signal to a user at any given time. And where the strongest signal comes from doesn't necessarily mean that it came from the closest tower. This data will tell you where the signal was coming from, but it cannot pinpoint where it was going to. You also will hear about some of Tim's behavior, like he got a new phone that weekend. Again, this doesn't tell you that much. First, his girlfriend bought him that phone. You'll hear that before this, and you heard that before this, Tim had to buy prepaid phone cards. His girlfriend bought him this phone and put him on her plan. Second, he put his new phone number on Facebook, not a move of somebody trying to hide. And you might be astonished at how many people in this case had multiple phones and multiple phone numbers. The state's case will be at its strongest if you narrow your vision to the evidence that supports their case, and if you discourage yourself from pushing against those false boundaries. But don't let the state dismiss the questions you will have as insignificant or as speculation. Critically thinking and upholding your oath and duty is not speculating. Your questions will reflect reasonable doubt and expose how inadequate the investigation was and how incomplete this case is. I think this is a good time to talk about Jenna. We don't know much about Jenna, and the state's not going to tell you much about her either. The investigation barely looked into her. The state knew about some of the men she was close with. They knew that she was on the verge of homelessness when Christine led her into her home once Dean left for Florida. But what was going on with her? Why was she in that position? Did anyone have a motive to kill her? You heard how brutal her murder was. Over 40 stab wounds, like it was a crime of passion. We have few answers about Jenna or her killer because the state barely investigated how she spent her final days. But the state will use Jenna as a tool to try to create a narrative against Tim. You may be encouraged to believe that Tim was supposedly concerned about Jenna. She was an informant. But this suggestion doesn't withstand scrutiny. First, Jenna was Christine's guest, and Tim was deferential to Christine. He trusted Christine. Second, let's go to early Friday morning. The state referenced that Tim was at Josh's house. After Tim hung out with Josh, he returned to Muterboro, returned to the home, where he hung out with Christine and Jenna for hours. The women were alive and happy when he was there, and they still were when he left. This part is well documented. On video, you've seen some of it. You'll see Christine and Jenna doing chores, doing laundry, walking around. You'll see Christine on the enclosed porch, where she was likely refurbishing items to sell, and Tim was doing what he frequently did, helping her with her projects. Meanwhile, they were listening to music on an Alexa speaker. You'll hear their voices, their demeanor, as they shouted out names of songs and sang aloud. If Tim was ever skeptical of Jenna, the evidence shows that any skepticism was gone by the early hours of Friday. At the same time, you'll hear evidence and suggestions that Tim killed these women because he was out of his mind. Again, the documented evidence of Tim on those videos and in that audio presents an average man doing normal things, not a crazed maniac. One more point about this. Although you'll hear about Tim's demeanor from Josh and Dean, you'll hear from other witnesses who knew about Tim, like Kathy Bradstreet, that she saw him shortly before the murders, and he looked much better and healthier than he did the month prior. And you'll hear that Tim's general feeling of being ill or in discomfort coincided with his efforts to reduce his drug use. Why will you hear suggestions about Tim losing his mind and becoming homicidal? Because you won't hear any credible or convincing explanation for why Tim would commit heinous murders. He had no motive to kill them. Suggestions that Tim became a homicidal maniac because he may have been feeling dazed or unwell is speculation. It's wild speculation. And it's the type of speculation that the state has warned you not to take. I'll leave you with a few quick points to think about. Consider the other players you will learn about in this case, their suspicious behavior that they can't account for, their trips to the house, their cryptic communications, their associations with Dean. One moment that will stick out to you is from the Friday afternoon the women were killed. Josh sends Dean an urgent message. There's a problem. On a scale of 1 to 10, this emergency is a 10. You saw those texts on the screen. Josh wants to talk immediately, but not over the phone and not over text. The conversation, he says, must be over an untraceable, encrypted app. What do you think that conversation was about? Josh will say he was just expressing concern about Christine. But guess who Josh never texts or calls to check in on? Christine. Why would you urgently need to communicate over an untraceable app just to express a vague feeling of concern about someone? Then on 4 a.m. on Saturday morning, Josh runs to the house alone to snatch a camera outside he believed may have captured the killer. Why? Josh thought that this camera was independent from the rest of the surveillance system, which had 8 or 10 cameras throughout the property. He thought this camera could record even if the rest of the system was shut down. You'll hear that he was wrong, but it won't answer the obvious question of why he did that. You also heard a little bit about the other people that went to the house that weekend at the behest of Dean. What were all these people not doing, including Josh and Dean when Dean finally arrived? They weren't calling the police, not for days. Finally, when Dean eventually gets to the house early Saturday morning, after spending 90 minutes in the car with Josh from the airport, he waited 2 hours before calling the police. Instead, he and Josh walked around the house. Dean took pictures of a bloody mattress and texted it to friends. Dean turned the surveillance system back on. It took 2 hours for Dean to call 911. At the end of the case, the state may argue that they don't need to prove exactly what happened, as long as they prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. They may say that questions you have aren't relevant to the deliberations, that they aren't relevant to the elements, that they answered everything you needed to hear. Remember, these are arguments. Hold the state to its burden. Don't let them shed it. Don't walk away thinking that your significant and fundamental questions aren't important, because they are. And they arise from the many sources of reasonable doubt throughout this case. One thing is indisputable. The state needs to prove to you exactly who killed these women. They're speculating it was Tim. They're pointing at the wrong man. The evidence doesn't support convicting Tim. Tim did not kill those women, and Tim is not guilty.
All right, thank you.